Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. So welcome to the launch event of Index on Censorship Spring Magazine edition, The Forgotten Patients. I'm Sarah Dawood, editor at Index on Censorship. So just to give you a bit of context, our latest magazine issue is all about lost voices in the global healthcare system. So we've looked at marginalised groups who fall between the cracks of healthcare provision and then have their concerns either ignored or silenced. And we looked at everything from the poor treatment of maternity care, whistleblowers in the NHS, to corruption in the Nigerian and Ugandan health systems, to the dire state of women's healthcare in Afghanistan. So we really did look across the world. And one issue I personally explored was healthcare in war zones, and in particular, how the psychological impacts of living in a war zone are seldom spoken about or prioritised. So Index on Censorship is a free expression magazine and organisation, and our primary mission is to give a voice to the voiceless. So we help those who have been punished for speaking out against oppressive or authoritarian regimes to be heard. But for some, losing their voice can be literal and physical. And so I explored how children, specifically in Gaza, have been left literally speechless, so unable to speak or communicate due to psychological trauma. And just like those who live in countries with severe free speech restrictions, they're also unable to tell their stories. So that's why today we're going to be focusing the panel on that discussion, and we'll be talking about how war trauma can leave children and adults, but particularly children, unable to communicate. And we're going to be looking at both Gaza and Ukraine, and we've got a brilliant selection of panelists who are going to be talking about this. So we're going to do about 45 minutes to an hour of panel discussion, and then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes of audience Q&A at the end. So please do, if you have questions, save them up and we can come to them towards the end. So please do think about those. But before we move on to our panelists, we're just going to first hear from Yumna El Sayed, who's joining us virtually. So Yumna is an Egyptian-Palestinian journalist who's done incredibly brave work covering the war in Gaza on the ground as a correspondent for Al Jazeera English. Yumna, her husband, and her 4 children were living in Gaza under extremely dangerous circumstances until January last year, when they managed to evacuate to Cairo, where they now live. So it's a real privilege to have her here with us today. So firstly, thank you so much, Yumna, for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really delighted to be here among you, even though it's just virtual, but that wouldn't be a reason for not to participate in such an important discussion. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So can you start just by telling everyone about a bit about your personal experiences? So what was it like for you psychologically living and working in a war zone, particularly as a journalist in such a dangerous career?
Well, first of all, I always get asked the question, what was this war different than other wars? How was this war different than other wars? And every single time I get asked that question, I try to think of all the different reasons that make this particular war so much different than other wars. But then I just realized that the main issue is that we don't realize how simple it is. All the previous ones were wars. This one was a genocide. We, the people on the ground, did not realize it was a genocide from the very beginning. The rest of the world did not realize that it was a genocide being practiced systematically, day after day, action after action. And that's how it was completely different. A war is completely different than a genocide. The impact of this genocide, physically and emotionally, on each and every person in Gaza is indescribable. When I came out of Gaza, for the very first moment I got into my dad's home in Cairo, I felt this very strange feeling that for the first time, there is a sense of safety that I had completely lost. And that sense of safety made me feel that I can break down. My breakdown wasn't that I cried and I screamed and I brought out all the rage and anger and terror that was in my heart. No, Sarah, it was completely different. I literally stopped speaking. That same thing happened to me. And for days, every single person around me told me just one thing. You need to see a therapist. You need to speak to a therapist. You need to visit a therapist. Let's try online sessions. Let's try bringing a therapist at home. Let's try taking you to a therapist. Nobody realized that. I just asked myself one question. What can I tell the therapist? I did not find words to express the amount of anger, rage, frustration, despair. All these words are not expressions to the feelings that I felt. They can't express the extent of these feelings that I felt for the first time. And I've seen it in my children. I've seen it in my husband. These are the most close people to me. I've seen it around me everywhere in Gaza. Every single time a home was leveled with children inside, and these children were pulled out of the rubble, completely stunned and shocked and speechless, not realizing where they are, what has happened to them. How can they just be asleep or playing or eating? And the next moment, they just find themselves literally under the rubble. And people spend hours trying to dig them out. They go to hospitals looking at other children and other patients and other injuries thrown literally everywhere on the ground. We're not talking about beds. That state of a hospital where you enter and you find rooms and beds and patients on beds and on machinery, that's not even found. You enter a hospital where there is an injured everywhere in every space on that floor of the hospital. There's blood everywhere. People, doctors, nurses running from patient to another, from injured to another. Children screaming and crying, and women and men and elderlies. They find themselves just in the middle of all that, not realizing what happened. I was just sleeping. I was just eating. That's the last thing they can remember. And some of them, after days pass, they realize that they lost a limb. And sometimes I feel that when we speak about it like that, like we say, oh, they lost a limb. No, they lost their leg, their hand, their arm. They lost a piece of their body. The most thing they used to rage me was that I felt that every single time I stood in front of the camera, I wasn't able to explain to the people the details. When I say children are injured, 10 children have been injured and brought to hospital today. It's just so unfair. I felt that the words didn't make sense anymore. And it just kept on going like that. It kept on piling up like that. That sense of fear, that sense of indescribable panic and terror. When I used to see my little one hearing a rocket coming from the sound of a missile coming close, and she just stands in the middle of the house and she screams, and then she just freezes and starts shivering like that. She can't even move. I've seen that scene hundreds of times in just 3 months. Hundreds of times. I've seen it in my children. I've seen it in children in the hospital yards. I've seen it in tents. I've seen it in neighborhoods. That is something people don't see on camera. They don't realize the amount of trauma that these children, adults, women, men, elderly, each and every single person in Gaza is actually living and going through until today.
And thank you so much, Yumna. I mean, so now you're in relative safety in Cairo. How has living in a war zone impacted your children more long term? Have you seen personally? How have you noticed? Have you noticed many long term changes in their behavior or in how they speak or how they communicate?
Well, yes, of course. I can tell you, I can give you like a glimpse of each and every one of my children with their ages and the most thing that they're traumatized of. For example, Eileen, who just turned 14 yesterday, she was 12 when this genocide began. She, until now, feels a great amount of rage and anger. She's angry at everyone and everything. She's angry that people around the world are watching them. They're watching Gaza being destroyed. They're watching her friends being killed. They're watching everything being leveled to the ground and not doing anything about it. She literally tells me every single day, I don't want to live here. I don't care if there is a war or not here. I want to go back and die in Gaza. I want to die in Gaza because I don't want to live among people who are okay with seeing thousands of children being slaughtered every day. She tells me, I pray every night to be killed again in Gaza, to go back to Gaza and get killed there. And I have to deal with this every single day. And I tell her, Aline, why don't we see a therapist that you can speak to? She told me one thing. After a very long period of discussion and convincing, she told me, the therapist asked me one question. He said, how was your childhood? She told me, I told him, wait, let me show you. She opened a video of all the wars that she turned 14. She's been living the past 13 years under an Israeli blockade. She witnessed the 2014 war, the 2021 war, numerous and endless escalations, and this genocide. So she told me, I showed him a video and I said, this is my childhood. How do you expect me to be? She can't cope. She goes to school. She doesn't speak to anyone. She doesn't have friends in class. She doesn't stand the fact that her other colleagues in class do not boycott products that she believes are financing and weaponizing Israel. She says this is money to buy bombs to kill us. How can they just be so careless? How can they not know what is happening to us? Muhammad, for example, my 13-year-old, who's turning 13 next month, stopped playing soccer completely. Since he came out of Gaza, he has not played soccer once. He refuses to play soccer, although it is his favorite sport. And in Gaza, he was in a soccer academy for years, and it is the most thing that he loved. He tells me, I do not want to play soccer because my friends are not there anymore. They're either killed or in Gaza or have evacuated to other places. Serene, she just turned 10. She was 8. The most thing that terrified Serene during the genocide was that she always thought about being an only survivor. Every single night, Sarah, she told me, Let's sleep very close to each other so that when a missile falls, it kills us all at once and no one survives. Every single night she asked me, Mommy, what will I do if you all die and I live alone? What will happen to me? Or what will happen to Juju, her 5-year-old sister? Until now, Serene can't sleep alone in her own bed. Recently, she started sleeping with Eileen next to her on the same bed because she recently stopped sleeping with me on my same bed. And it was bit by bit. It was sleeping with me on my same bed for a couple of months and then sleeping on a mattress next to me. And now she sleeps next to her big sister or older sister in her room. And she's still terrified at night and comes to sleep with me, next to me. Juju was her most trauma was when she lost her kitten, Fluffy. Juju stopped speaking in Gaza when we were displaced from Gaza City to the south on foot. We weren't able to take Fluffy with us because we were not allowed to carry her with us. She was traumatized since that moment. She stopped speaking, she stopped eating, she stopped talking, she stopped playing, she stopped doing anything. She was always crying. Every single time you look at her, she's just tearing. Every time she watches Fluffy's pictures, until now, she cries. And she asks me, Mommy, do you think Fluffy is alive? And I say, yes. I'm sure she's alive, and I'm sure she's become big now and healthy and is like all around. So she would say, like, but she used to be very afraid of the bombs and the sounds of the bombs. And I don't even know if Fluffy is alive or not, because the friend who we left Fluffy at his place, his home was bombed and he was killed. But I never get to tell her that. Of course, Juju never leaves my side until this day. This is just like the glimpse or the crust of so many complicated trauma for children who have evacuated for an entire year. They are here, but every single time they try to reach their friends, they tell me, Mommy, my friend at school, she was killed. My teacher was killed. Our school was bombed. Numerous of their friends and classmates were killed with their families and their teachers. And the fact that they cried for their school when their school got bombed and not their school. They cried more than they cried when our home got bombed. Can you believe it? Can you believe how much children are attached to their school? They spent days crying for their school because their school was bombed.
Yumna, thank you so much. Yes, I'm so sorry for what you've been through, and thank you so much for sharing your incredibly traumatic and difficult experiences. We're going to go to the panel, but we're going to bring you back in for the Q&A at the end. So anyone in the audience, if you'd like to ask Yumna a question, we can come to that at the end. So thank you so much again, Yumna. So let me introduce our panel then. So we have Rafael González at the end, who is a clinical psychologist and a special advisor to medical aid for Palestinians. We've then got Ryan Soden, who is a health services researcher and a speech and language therapist, and she's worked with refugees with speech and language difficulties. Then we have Kieran King, who is head of humanitarian at the UK-based charity War Child, and he's personally spent some time in Gaza as well in January. And then we have Gabrielle Ujviak, who's a UK-based journalist, and she's reported from Ukraine and has written about the psychological impact of war on children. So we're going to start with just a short introduction from each of our panelists about their experiences of this topic and why this topic is important to them. So Rafael, would you like to start? Sorry.
Hello. Hi. Yeah. So hello, everyone. As a psychologist, primarily in the NHS, I work in a specialist service for neurodiversity. So I specialize in child mental health, specifically the interplay with neurodevelopment. Also, when I am also an honorary researcher and lecturer in Imperial College. For a long time, my interest has been in child mental health. And at some point, I became more interested in the interplay between trauma and how that impacts development in children. At some point, I became involved with Medical Aid for Palestinians, mostly on the advisory panel for mental health programs. And I've been able, as part of that role, to go into the West Bank and other areas, not in Gaza, to scope for, as a scoping mission, to scope for the need for specific trauma services over there. I would say the challenge has always been how, in a certain mismatch of coming from a position in the West, thinking of trauma models in the West, and how does that apply to the situation, to each particular situation. I think it's often a big dilemma, especially when we're thinking about situations that, in an ideal situation, we impact on trauma specifically after the situation has been finished and there's a period of adaptation, which is not something that is actually happening at all in the Palestinian territories or in Gaza, for instance. So it's a big challenge. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Salden, so I'm a speech and language therapist and a health services researcher. It's quite complicated really describing how I kind of came to be here, but essentially I trained as a speech and language therapist. Lots of my work was working with refugee families who at that point were largely coming from Syria. And since then, I've moved into academia as a health service researcher. I think for the genocide in Gaza, my sort of involvement in that, lots of my friends are from Gaza. And as an academic, I just remember this point in the pandemic where there was this total shutdown. What can we do as people watching all of this happen? And academic research largely paused because of COVID, lockdowns, all of this stuff. And people just started doing COVID research, lots of this. And then this wasn't happening. This wasn't mirrored within health services research, speech and language therapy. The support just wasn't there. And I didn't really understand that. So I'm part of like a small speech and language therapy community where we are trying to get things done, but it's on a very small individual level at the moment.
Thanks, Ryan.
Sure. Thank you. It's a huge microphone. My name's Kieran. I'm the head of humanitarian for War Child. War Child's a humanitarian organisation, works across 15 conflicts globally, kind of based out of London and Amsterdam. And for me, I've spent the last 15 years working predominantly in conflict zones, different organisations, 10 years with Save the Children, and now with War Child. And I guess I did do a degree in psychology with a focus on child developmental psychology, but can't call myself clinical or an expert in that field at all, so I'll defer any questions on that. But what really sparked my interest, particularly with children in conflict, and then the mental health and psychosocial support of children in conflict, was working in post-conflict Sierra Leone, which was my first posting. And there, I was working on a social rehabilitation, behavioural change, social inclusion program for ex-child soldiers. And what really interested me is we had interventions for kind of supporting community stigma around issues concerning children's mental health, but not so much programmatically. How do you, in a conflict or post-conflict environment, actually respond to the impact of conflict on a child's mental well-being or psychosocial well-being? So yeah, since then I've worked predominantly with children's charities in Africa and the Middle East, and lived in Gaza and the West Bank for 2 years with my family in 2021 and 2022. Been remotely leading war child's response in Gaza since the escalation of the war, the start of this war. And was back there in November and December, actually not January, but last year, before the ceasefire. And I've also been in and out of Ukraine since the beginning of the escalation in 2022.
Hello. I'm feeling quite down after hearing this terrible testimony. So try and get some energy back to this discussion because it's such an important topic. And I'm really glad that we have the chance to talk about this today. It's kind of a strange coincidence that I was asked to talk about this because in 2022, so I'll go back there. I'm a freelance journalist and I used to work on a magazine in the UK called Children and Young People Now, which is the leading title on disadvantaged children in the UK. But after actually working in Sierra Leone for a couple of months as a volunteer with street children, I left and decided to go freelance and focus on children living in disadvantage around the world. I very much believe that there should be more children's voices in the media and that often children's perspectives are left out of reporting. So that's kind of how I try and approach stories. When the full-scale invasion began in February 2022 in Ukraine, I'd kind of been in and out of work after 3 periods of maternity leave. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my 2-year-old son and heard the news on the radio. And as I'm half Polish, this felt much more like a personal tragedy for me because my family is very close to that border and I very much felt like they're going to be sweeping across Poland and it's all going to be over. And I thought I need to get to that country and report on children somehow, even though I haven't been on a reporting trip for about 8 years. So I found some funding from a project called the Dart Center for Trauma and Journalism, which is based at Columbia Journalism School in New York. And I went to the western part of Ukraine, to Lviv, in June 2022, to start my research specifically looking at how the war was impacting young children's mental health, so 0 to 6-year-olds, because this is the age group that's hardest to report on because obviously like they can't speak already, they're learning how to speak. And generally reporters want to have a quick quote. Since then, the war carries on, so I carry on. I'm still writing about children in Ukraine and I've been back when I do reporting from here as well. Yeah, and I think this issue about speech is very interesting because it is something I did try and look into right back in 2022, and I have some really interesting research to share with you that I found at that point. But it's been very hard to place a story on that issue because it is such a recognised thing, but I think we'll go on to that later.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks, everyone. So I wondered if, Rafael, I could start with you. From a clinical psychologist perspective, how can psychological trauma result in speech issues and what kind of speech issues do you tend to see? And can you talk a bit about that link a little bit?
Sure. I think from the developmental perspective, right? So speech, I think most of us would understand that or attribute when a child is feeling anxious, they might stutter, right? It's like the very stutter can happen for all sorts of reasons, but it's usually quite common sense that a child may be, experiencing that. There's lots of reasons of impacts on the actual neural aspects or neural pathways in development that can impact the onset of starting speech. Now, further to that, and this is something that we observed as part of the trauma scoping mission in the West Bank, is that the rates of what we would attribute here in the West to selective mutism, right? And it's basically just becoming quiet, maybe you can expand on that, tend to be quite higher. And that's often a very clear indication of stress. Now, in my own experience, what the children were presenting, for instance, in Bedouin refugee camps in the outskirts of the West Bank, or in Jenin, for instance, just last year after October 7, following lots of incursions from settlers into their communities, is that the rates increase of not only language difficulties, which are estimated to be 30 to 50% of children in all conflict zones, but also other developmental markers, like there were some increases in seizures as well, increases in bedwetting, and also, not surprisingly, in behavioral and, emotional manifestations. So from my own perspective, and of course, it's important to bear in mind that to somebody who is more trained or has a more foundation in psychodynamics will have a very particular formulation of these difficulties. As a psychologist in neurodiversity, or perhaps many ways a neuropsychologist, I come at this at the impacts of trauma and stress on child development. That can be temporary, or just like a certain time-limited delay, or it may have some implications in the long term as well.
And just to be clear to the audience, so when you say selective mutism, do you want to just explain that in a bit more detail? Is that when children sort of speak in certain situations, but they get such social anxiety they don't speak in others?
Of course. And that's a very, very good question. So we see when the word mute obviously suggests somebody who's just not speaking, right? So when we talk about selective, is under the premise that the child actually can speak and communicate really well in many other contexts. So in my usual clinical practice, this may happen when a child doesn't speak specifically to males, or it doesn't speak specifically in school, or to a particular teacher, right? It can be highly specific, right? Or it can be a bit more broader. So in the context that I'm using it here, it's just suggesting that this particular child was able to speak fluently and well and express themselves well. And from a point onwards, that stopped, right? So we can exclude that it's actually, something that a delay in speech, or a more pragmatic difficulty with speech. It's almost something that is post a particular situation, which can be very specific to a particular anxiety, stress, or what we are suggesting here is a post-traumatic event.
And what can be the trigger for that happening? What sort of triggers would you see in war zones typically? Is it the things you would expect, like sort of drone attacks, bomb attacks, or are there other triggers, smaller triggers perhaps?
Bearing in mind that with specific causes, this can be multiple. In the context that I saw, it was following like incursions from drones, settler attacks, and an actual, the way they call it in their martyrs, people being murdered. Okay, it's a children that there's this siren and they will have a startup response. It's basically an ongoing situation of stress and alertness, and it's following that. I think obviously as a speech and language therapist, I imagine she will have some specific things to say about this as well. So
Ryan, did you want to come in at all on anything?
I would say you must be an honorary speech and language therapist. That's pretty good going. I would say normally the children I've worked with in the UK who maybe haven't come from refugee backgrounds, it can be any kind of event. It's part of an anxiety disorder essentially. So it could be something like starting school. That's often a very common one. It's normally around the age of 4 or 5. But within a war or kind of trauma response in a more specific way, it could just be anything that would be traumatic. I'm thinking some of the children I used to work with, when I would be taking their case histories of the parents and asking about, trying to discern if there was any kind of psychological involvement, any trauma. And, some of the memories where they turned around and saw their home being blown up, or it was not safe for them to be talking while they were making their journeys as refugees through countries. Those things would all be very much there.
Yeah. And thanks, Ryan. And Rafael, you mentioned sort of the long-term impact. Something I'm interested in. For many of these children, obviously the trauma will be ongoing and there's little respite, and there'll be sort of traumatic event after traumatic event. What do you see as kind of long-term impacts from that of just living in a perpetual state of fear? Is there sort of a way to come back or recover from that?
Well, that is probably the most essential question in the context of thinking about trauma. This is something that when I met a group of, they were all female psychologists or counselors that were in Nablus, One of the first things, talking about the nature of trauma, I'm thinking specifically about where to allocate funding for interventions further down the line. The first thing they say, well, you know, PTSD, right? Everybody knows what that is, but there's no post, you know, there's simply no post for trauma here. It's just ongoing. You know, as I mentioned before, the whole concept in Western and in evidence-based practice for trauma is that trauma happens when it's complex, happens multiple times, which is really what we're talking about here. Then after a period of adaptation and passes, then we go back to that narrative. And in some ways, it's a lot about language. It's about how the person reconstructs the narrative of what happened, and they basically go through the trauma. But if the situation keeps on going, we're looking at something quite different. And in many ways, it's not really well defined in the, just to put it very simply, there are no treatments for it that are evidence-based under psychological therapists, because in fact, it's counterintuitive and counterproductive to try to treat something that is ongoing, you know. So the person, at the end of the day, the trauma is it's a mechanism, the trauma response is an adaptation to something that is happening for the person to feel they can survive it. In this context is, well, I don't have any words. I'm going to shut down, or I'm going to be really angry, like one of her sons, you know. So, especially children, they all respond in trauma in different ways, but it's an adaptation of survival. So why do something to take that away if the situation is still ongoing? Now, so the idea would be to really, I mean, an ideal word is just to end the conflict and the occupation, right? First off, but in the meantime, most of the efforts is around first aid and support, providing support in the here and now, and then examine what are the implications long term. But obviously, the outlook is very grim, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there are changes even in the neural pathways in, you know, mental health, and it can be quite extensive. So we're looking at it, potentially also looking at from the macro perspective, quite a public health catastrophe, really, in terms of mental health.
Thank you, Rafael. Kieran, I was going to move on to you. Obviously, you mentioned you've spent time in several sort of conflict zones, but you were most recently in Gaza doing humanitarian work. I wondered if you could talk a bit from your perspective and experience what psychological or speech issues you saw amongst children.
Sure, I can tell you what I saw, and also what my colleagues who are there on the ground kind of report as well. I think when I think of the answer to that question, I think of specific instances, right, which really struck me even compared to other conflicts that I've worked in. And one was at that time, this is in November, and so this is pre-ceasefire. The war was raging. At that point, there were around, no one knew how many displacement camps there were in Gaza, because they were popping up every day, like new displacement camps, new evacuation orders, people moving, reorganizing, regrouping. But at that time, there were around 500, we think, and I was in one of those. And in that displacement camp, there was a community learning space, really, you know, rough and ready, set up by that displaced community themselves. And in there was some learning activities, some kind of recreational activities. And the story I sort of messaged my wife that evening was meeting a young boy called Yusuf. He was 5, same age as my son, which is why it struck me, I think. And he reportedly, one of the psychologists that we work with, had been having one-on-one sessions with him because since his parents were both killed in July last year, this was November, he hadn't spoken at all, apparently, to anyone. So he was there. He'd been identified through this, through a methodology and approach, singled out for more specialist support, and he'd been asked to draw his emotions, and a simple A4 piece of paper, a happy face on one side and a sad face on the other side. And on the happy side was him, and what he told me through the psychologist was his family on a beach with a beach ball and a sun awning. And on the bad side was a plane, bomb, what apparently was rubble and bits of concrete and rebar, and then dismembered heads of who he said was his family. This is a 5-year-old, but again, communicating through this psychologist, but apparently communicating just in writing. But so that was one example. But you see, my colleagues tell me, so War Child, among other things, does a lot of child protection case management. So we identify children who have specific vulnerabilities, specific risks, and try and address those one by one on an individual basis. And they tell me, our caseworkers tell me, they see every child they encounter, they see some psychological effect or psychosocial effect. And I'm not qualified to identify that just by being in a displacement camp and looking and observing, but I did see children in the corner not participating in the group activities. I saw children rocking, and yeah, you do have a kind of a split in those centres, people on one side, people on the other, and the people on one side are kids who don't want to get involved and don't want to engage. I think at that time, I'll finish in a second, but when I worked in Gaza in 2021 and 2022, I was with Save the Children. We commissioned a report at that time, a survey on the psychological impact of the blockade on Gaza, and found, I think it was 59% of children at that point were identified as demonstrating some type of speech or communication issue. That was already up from 42% in 2018. And now we know we've commissioned a report and worked with a local organisation on a report in July, which was published in November, that 96% of children reported expecting to die as a result of the war, and 49% wanting to die as a result of the war. So I think it's not talking directly about speech, but you can extrapolate, I think, the impact of that.
And what did you see in terms of provision? Because so when I was researching my article, I spoke with a Gazan speech and language therapist on the ground, and he told me there was a real lack of crucial tools for him to actually do the work he needed to do. So for instance, soundproof rooms are really helpful because they help to block out noise and distractions for young patients, but he didn't have access to a soundproof room to do his work. And then a psychotherapist I spoke to from Médecins Sans Frontières told me that there was just a general lack of mental health care, just in general, because priority was understandably given to physical trauma and emergency care, and mental health care only tended to be given to children who'd had some kind of physical trauma as well. So I just wondered, from what you saw, how much provision did you see on the ground for things like psychological or speech and language therapy?
I mean, globally, I think somewhere between 0.5 and 1% of overseas development aid is allocated to mental health and psychosocial support. So that has an impact in the context of like Gaza, for example, where so much of it comes down to the lack of a workforce, qualified people who know how to speak to children, whether it's on a clinical level or not. So what we saw early on is, because understandably, and we still see it today, like the focus is on immediate life-saving support. And as such, you get, when I met a number of the leaders for our national organization partners in Cairo in August last year, they were saying one of the biggest risks to them was, they used the word poaching, but it's the diversion, I guess, if you like, of specialist staff, psychologists, counselors, to non-specialist roles, because that's where the funding's allocated, that's where NGOs are recruiting, and that was a massive problem. So some might call it brain drain in other contexts, but that's a huge problem for local organizations in Gaza, maintaining some level of capacity. And there are 5 psychiatrists in Gaza. At least that's what I was told by our partner Gaza Community Mental Health Program. So 5 psychiatrists in Gaza, which massively limits the opportunities for supervision as well. So that's something I was highlighting as a massive challenge. And then there's the obvious things. If you're talking about hardware, I'm not an expert in the delivery of psychosocial assistance to children in conflicts. I manage teams who do and are, but you're talking about tents. First, obviously, as we know, there's no safe space in Gaza, even so now than there was when I was there in November. But you're talking about a tent, limited people who are able to know how to work with children for any sort of meaningful outcome. And I think the other thing to say is maybe a bit more informally is the feeling of futility around it as well, and this phenomenon in Gaza of repeat trauma. By the time you've unpacked, not cure or treat, as we've heard, but by the time you've tried to unpack or address or help a child to mitigate or understand what's happened, they're displaced again another 3 times. So our staff, we have about 10 staff in Gaza. We work with 6 local organisations with hundreds of staff. Just among our staff, they've each been displaced an average of 12 times since the start of the conflict. So yeah, there's a lot more I could say. But
thank you so much. Gabriella, I want to ask you some questions. So you've reported from Ukraine as a journalist, and you've written a lot on this topic in particular, and on psychological war trauma in children. Can you tell us a bit about what you found in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion in 2022 on this topic?
Yeah, so like when I was trying to think, have I met a child that's had specific language problems? I have heard teachers tell me about pupils in their classes that have had this kind of a mutism episode, and usually it's lasted a week or perhaps a few months, but it has ended. And that's been in response usually to a parent being killed, usually a father who's joined the military. I've met a lot of psychologists, and unlike Gaza, where aid can barely go, Ukraine is full of aid, and there's so much psychological support. There are government schemes, there are helplines. UNICEF has created all these online resources. Every school has a psychologist. You know, this country has really embraced that as a way to deal with this issue, even though, as Rafael said, it's kind of almost a bit futile trying to treat a problem when you're still not in a safe place. But I've never had anyone mention a speech and language therapist. And I mentioned before this academic that I found, Antonia Skripnik, who's at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. So she's a linguistics researcher, and she did a specific study in 2022 looking at children's speech and how it had been impacted by the early days of the full-scale invasion. But she also tells me she has never heard of a speech and language therapist working in trauma. She knows that they exist to help with children with special educational needs, but beyond that, she doesn't believe that there's any resource for this in the country. She's so desperate for this to be raised, like to raise awareness of this, that despite the fact that her neighbour's house was bombed in that Kyiv shelling last week, and she ended up in hospital with herself having a trauma reaction, she still sat down and wrote me 4 pages of comments to tell you about today, which gives you an idea of how people are feeling over there right now. But her research was great because she looked at 40 children that had experienced direct kind of witnessed someone being killed, direct shelling, had been displaced, and compared it to a control group of children. And she noticed things like speech repetition, vagueness, and an inability to process information and to express themselves. Sometimes, which was a very specific thing, but she noticed that the children were using the personal pronoun my a lot more than is common in the Ukrainian language. They would say, when can I go back to my Kyiv? Or when can I go back to my country? In Ukrainian, you don't usually use that. These like very specific small things that she was picking up. There was a child she told me about who hadn't been able to speak for 3 months. And they were using art therapy to treat him. And this is the kind of therapy that I've mainly observed in Ukraine. It's like the main way to help children. And she said he was just scribbling on a page with a black pen. And after about 3 months, he managed to choose a green pen and draw his house or something. And this is also common. Most of the children that I observed and psychologists I spoke to said that children would draw pictures of their homes, and often then the parent would be far from the home because they were just constantly thinking about that. And I think it's really important to try and imagine the child's perspective. That's why I'm so glad that Fluffy the cat was brought up, because children always talk about their pets. And I think as adults, we think that's completely ridiculous. I mean, we've saved you. You've been removed from a place of danger. We've evacuated you. Why are you talking about your pet dog or cat? But that's completely like what they loved so much and they had to let go of, and it can really just disturb them. Is that okay?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Gabriella. No, really interesting. Maybe then, Ryan, I might come to you then, because I mean, you mentioned, Gabriella, around play therapy. I think that's really interesting. I wondered, Ryan, whether you might want to talk about any kind of techniques or treatments that you've seen used or you've used yourself with children who've had traumatic induced speech and language issues.
Yeah. So I think this is working within the NHS, so within the UK. So working with the psychological team quite closely, and working through, there's like an established program for working with selective mutism by Maggie Johnson, the speech and language therapist, and trying to adapt that, because that was kind of the best thing we kind of had, and that's a program that's been developed for, I guess, selective mutism that has kind of occurred in a context, you know, within the UK, for example, where children might be frightened about going to school or something specific like that, kind of, I guess, less traumatic, to be really off. That's an awful thing to say, but and so trying to kind of adapt with that. But progress is really, really slow, but being patient and giving lots of space to be that. I think the things that really helped were kind of community-based activities as well, so putting the family in touch with children from similar backgrounds to be able to play with and have that social support for the parents as well. So it kind of unconventional, not so much evidence-based practice for, but just doing what you can do. Yeah.
Thank you. Obviously, so I mentioned at the start, at Index on Censorship, we raise awareness of how free speech, a fundamental human right, is being threatened globally. And many political activists, journalists, others put their lives on the line to tell their stories. But I mean, essentially, this is a slightly tangential take on that. But, you know, children with war-related trauma face a similar predicament. They can't tell their stories. So I wonder, like, how can we ensure children's crucial stories and experiences of war are not forgotten? I wonder, maybe Gabriella, as a reporter, as a journalist, you might want to come in.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I think we shouldn't always expect young children to be able to tell us their stories, and it's up to journalists to spend more time observing them and talking to their caregivers and trying to find out their stories in a kind of roundabout way that doesn't re-traumatize them. And that's the best way for them, and the only way really to get a small child to express himself. For example, I interviewed a boy called Stash last year, and he's turned 15 in December, but when he was 12, so just after the full-scale invasion began, he nearly died because he was in a house that a bomb landed on top of it in the Kharkiv region, and it didn't detonate, but the whole house fell on top of him while he was asleep, and he was evacuated first to Kyiv, then to Lviv. And for the last 3 years, he's just been trying to recover, basically. And he had an 8-centimeter skull injury. He's had multiple surgeries. And when I met him, he was really quiet. Like, he really didn't talk. And I honestly at first thought to myself, he's had a brain injury. He's obviously got some sort of physical like disability now. He can't actually speak. When he went out of the room to go and get something, I asked the mum and his sister, and they said, oh no, he's always been a quiet boy, he's very shy, he's actually fine, he can talk. And he came back and he brought me his whole wodge of pictures, and since he started doing art therapy, he just draws and draws and draws. And once he was going through these pictures, he did start to describe them to me and tell me like what they were and why he liked these things, which were mainly patriotic symbols or pictures of soldiers. And like that, I learned so much about him from that, but it took a long time to get that out of him. But then I understood that he is actually, you know, a communicative young boy. And the thing that I realized is that if that had never happened to him, who would he be now 3 years later? Perhaps he wouldn't be that shy, quiet boy his mum described. Perhaps by now he'd be a really vivacious, outgoing boy, because he hadn't had his whole life turned upside down. But like, that's just me speculating. So I've kind of gone.
So I think the question was around, well, you've answered it,
Yeah.
but around how we can ensure these children's stories and experiences get shared. But you say sort of finding those alternative modes of communication, drawing, play therapy.
And I think it would be really good to do more research into this. I mean, that's obviously a funding issue, but with data come stories. It's very hard to pitch a story to a newspaper if you haven't got any sort of hard evidence behind it. So if there could be some sort of more surveillance done on this, that would help. Yeah, and just generally trying to remind everybody that it's not just about politics and the military, because that's kind of the way that Ukraine stories have gone now. Civilians still there. with a lot of stories to tell, so we need to try and tell them.
So we're going to go to audience Q&A shortly. I just want to ask the panel one more question, which is just we've spoken about sort of the lack of provision and support in psychosocial support, mental health support in war zones. What do you think provision and support in this area should look like in future, and how can we balance this with the obvious need to prioritize physical trauma? And Rafael, did you make one?
I mean, yeah, I think it's important to also say that there are some glimmers of hope and some good initiatives. I'll give you 2 examples. Something I really like. You all agree that it's difficult to put into language these experiences for children, right? So, but I think you all agree that there's alternative ways of doing that by art therapy, drawing, basically using other means to express it. And I think that's following that is a very famous theater. I think it's in Naples, but I might be wrong. So the Freedom Theater. It's in Guinea. Thank you. I've been there, but I should know this. But so, and that is the whole concept when it originated with Arna and then her son. And I was able to see what they're doing there. So a lot of the exercises that the children were doing were not even speaking, they were just moving and acting, following some kind of dance routines and basically acting their feelings, right? And it's a very powerful experience. In addition to that, there's also the Palestinian Circus Society, which is the PCS. It's another initiative in which children are basically trained to do, circus acts, and it's actually highly successful as well. Both of these things are, especially the circus has been funding to expand to many other places in the West Bank, and there have been conversations about to do that in Gaza, and it may have been starting there. So, wow. So it's following the principle that you can use physical ways, kinesthetic ways, and artistic ways of expressing the emotion, and then eventually it leads to the actual expression in a narrative way. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Really interesting. Ryan?
Yeah, I think one thing I would just bring up is that obviously the hospitals have been completely decimated, schools, all the places where speech and language therapists would normally work, and the level of rebuilding a service is going to be huge. I think it's important to say outside of the speech and language therapy profession, there's lots of people who do support children who've got communication disorders, so their families obviously, but also teachers, nursery workers, people like that who do have skills. So I think it's in the same way that speech and language therapists who are still there, who have survived, have kind of moved into kind of doing more medical work, first aid, those kind of things, critical care. If people can kind of have a place to support children in those ways as well. So nursery work, less conventional, more kind of indirect approaches, I think.
Thank you. And Kieran, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to, from a humanitarian perspective, accepting that there's not going to be some big bankroll of funding for mental health psychosocial support for children in conflict. The opposite, aid cuts, a new reality, and the whole aid system is shifting now. Some of the push of that shift is going to be in a positive direction, accelerating the impetus for the traditional humanitarian system, the UN, international NGOs like the one I work for, working much more closely, shifting power and enabling civil society actors. And one of the drivers for that is, and which links to the question, I think, is when you're talking about mental health psychosocial support, and think the context in Gaza will need a 10-year minimum mental health care policy and system. And that's off the foundations of we don't know what. It has to be institutionalized somehow. And at the moment, there are no institutions in Gaza. So that's a long way of saying longer term funding. So increasing advocacy with donors, but longer term advocacy, longer term funding delivered through local actors who are the safeguards to those societies and those futures, because organizations like ours, we tend to leave, when we're not there after 10 years often. And the other point was, which I've now forgotten, is I think particularly in the context of Gaza and Ukraine to a lesser extent, I'd say, because there are such strong institutions, is looking at how you can build on existing platforms of support. So how can you integrate? I think it's kind of been said already, actually, but how you can integrate mental health, how you can expand a workforce and people who know how to work with children on psychosocial support and mental health challenges in the health system and in the education system. And a lot more research needs to be done on that. One of the big barriers, which I'm told, I'm constantly saying, look, we want to work with children in conflict. Let's research how to do that better and what the impact is of these interventions that we design. We do have them, but real barriers, I think ethical barriers to conducting research in conflict. And that's an issue again. So a lot of it's about accepting what the realities are in terms of the system's ability to support civil society and then finding ways around that.
Thank you. Gabriella?
What I've been thinking about a lot is making it okay for children in Ukraine to say that they are not okay. So one thing I find a lot is, although that there is an understanding that therapy can help, and if somebody experiences something kind of obvious, like their husband is killed or they are displaced, then they might say, yes, I'll have a bit of therapy. But there's a kind of general collective national rhetoric I see, like some people wouldn't like me to say this, that they are strong and they will carry on and they will win and they're going to be fine. And sometimes I feel like there's going to be a bit like a breakdown if there's an end and there's a point where they feel safe, that they might suddenly all fall apart. So I feel like there would be a way to help people themselves say we need more help, and especially maybe teenagers and like people on the brink of adulthood who are especially feeling this pressure that they need to either stay in the country and help defend it, or leave and gain skills so that they can return and help rebuild it in the future. There's a lot on their shoulders. So I think if they could themselves say, we need extra resource and we need extra support, then that might be a bit of a driver.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Yumna. So we're going to go to some audience questions. Does anyone have any questions, panel, at all? Yeah.
My question really is based on my long life. I'm 84 years old, and I was born in a family that my mother's family had escaped World War I to South America, and my father's family had fled from World War II to South America. And I can tell you that the victims of today's war seem to be very lucky compared to what the victims in those wars were, because the traumas, of course, were the same, because human beings are all the same, but they didn't have so many organizations looking after people victims of war. But my question is, what else do you think politicians can do with the war industry? There is the same as the film industry. Film industry produces films. The shoe industry produces shoes. The war industry produces wars. And politicians, whether they like them or not, they are forced to organize sales of all the manufacturing that we do, of tanks, of helicopters, drones, everything. So why don't we all work towards changing this absurd system, so inhumane and so indecent, that only benefits politicians and, of course, the merchants of death, the manufacturers. There is, if otherwise, when you will be 80 years old, you'll be doing the same that you are doing today, saying the same. Nothing will change ever.
So the question is, what more could politicians do in
Western politicians have no. I speak to many politicians, and I lived for 7 years in Geneva in close contact with the United Nations, and I call them International War Club, and the Security Council is the Insecurity Council.
Okay, would anyone like
and I will have to do something to change the planet, otherwise we'll have no planet left, and we will have World War II.
Sorry, very sorry to interrupt you, but we do want to get a few questions.
I'm telling you because it's suffering could be avoided
Yes.
instead of having always the description of the suffering of wars of
So,
wars. We should
let's- yeah.
stop this.
okay, so Kieran's going to come in on briefly on, and then we'll go to the next question. Yeah.
I mean, I'd give you a very different answer, I think,
Yeah.
and I don't have the answer, right? You have a much better answer than me, I think. But I'd given you a different answer last year compared to this year. We've seen with Gaza just a breakdown of international norms and the foundations on which, at least in the humanitarian advocacy space, influencing politicians to do the right thing and make the right choices. We no longer have the credibility of these systems, the International Criminal Court, Court of Justice, international humanitarian law. They've been undermined and eroded. So a different answer I give. So I think I would say now it's civil society, and it's making sure information is available, and that's where I'm not a journalist, but the value of journalism comes in more. How we reach grassroots organizations who can do meaningful advocacy to influence and, if necessary, shame politicians into action. We've seen some progress. I'm not going to say it's a win or a success. At least we've had in the last week, David Lammy and also the French and the Germans saying the 50-day blockade on aid to Gaza is unacceptable. It's not backed up by, and therefore we are imposing sanctions, and therefore we are suspending arms sales. That's the next step, has to be. But that's the result of civil society driven action. It's not the result of politicians doing the right thing.
Arafat died a multi-millionaire.
Okay, okay.
Accepting,
Sorry, we're gonna move on to some. We've got lots of hands up, so we're gonna move on to the next question. Sorry, but thank you very much. Oh yeah, Yumna, did you want to come in briefly? Oh, yeah.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
We'll move on to the next question.
Yes.
Yeah, there's quite a few hands up. I think you had your hand up first time around. Yeah, you want to come in?
Thank you. I mean, thank you, all of you, and especially Yumna. It must be so painful to have to keep telling these stories all the time. And what really strikes me, I've been working with theatre makers in Gaza for many years. It's kind of like everyone keeps telling the same story. I'm thinking, I don't know, of Disabled Words, written by Hossam Al-Madhoun, or Tonight We Die as a Family, written by Mohammed Al-Kurd. And yet everything has to do with the inability of words to express what is happening. And then we see that affecting children in the ways that have been described. And I was just thinking also about, I wonder if you could all maybe talk a bit about the systematic disabling, on the one hand, mass slaughter, but on the other hand, mass disabling of a population that is happening, and the mass slaughter of children.
Could you target your question at one panelist, just because I want to get a few
Okay,
questions, if
then
that's
maybe
okay.
sure,
Yeah.
to Yumna in that case. And then also instead, on a positive note, I've been thinking about Dr. Samah Jabr and her idea of post-traumatic growth. And I wonder if that makes any sense to you.
Thank you. So your question was about the mass slaughtering, or I'm sorry again?
Yeah, on the one hand, I think it's a mass slaughter, and on the other hand, it's a mass disabling, and they kind of go together, and specifically also slaughter of children and women who make children.
Well, that's true. When I said that this is different than any other war or previous wars because this is a systematic genocide, the goals and aims of this genocide is to decrease and to eliminate as much numbers of the civilians living in the Gaza Strip, whether by the direct targeting, the bombing, the enormous amounts of bombs raining on residents in their homes, and the bombing of entire neighborhoods and wiping them off, and then asking people to go to so-called safe zones, and then it's like grouping more and more people in empty places so that it's much more easier to kill them with bombs raining on them in tents, in thin sheet tents. And then the fact that you are using systematically food as a weapon. So if people are not dying in Gaza by direct bombs falling on them, They are shot by sniper bullets, and so many international doctors and delegations, not just Palestinian journalists, have spoken about such cases of shooting children and civilians, sniper shots killing them, and not just one shot, more than one shot. There are many reports and evidences about that. Then using food, starvation as a weapon to kill as much people. The entire world is watching how many people are being killed because of starvation, because of malnutrition. And then the systematic plan of spreading contagious diseases, because you're asking people to go to remote places with no water supply for hygiene, crammed and crowded over each other in very small areas where there is no access to water, and the spread of contagious and infectious diseases is indescribable. And then the prevention of the much needed medication. All these ways are systematically implemented to ethnically cleanse a population.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yumna, for coming in. We're going to move on to the next question. We've probably got time for 2 or 3 more. Martin, over there.
Yep. So I'm Martin Bright. I'm the editor-at-large at Index on Censorship. I wanted to ask about the role of empathy in your work. I've been very struck by your own personal trauma that's quite obvious from the people that have been speaking, particularly, obviously, Yumna's extraordinary journalism that is, she's able to report through the trauma. And indeed, Yumna, what has not been mentioned is the way that Yumna reported for Al Jazeera on October the 7th itself on what happened with the Hamas atrocities in Israel. So let's not forget that. And I was just going to ask where the place for empathy is here in both these conflicts. I've reported from Sderot in Israel, where it's quite clear that the trauma of the mothers in Sderot is real. They report similar instances of trauma among their children in terms of bedwetting, in terms of mutism. But when you talk to mothers in Sderot about their empathy for mothers across the border in Gaza, I'm talking anecdotally here as a reporter, often what they will say is, well, I'm talking about my children, not their children. So I suppose my question is to you, can we learn from common trauma of children in conflict? And the same might apply as well, of course, to the Russian children of Russian soldiers who've gone away and died in that conflict too. There is a potential appalling, tragic common ground here. Is this something that you've been able to look at?
Who would like to come in on that, on empathy, shared empathy? Yeah, Gabriella?
Yes, and then I also want to say something about that.
Yeah, you'll come to you in a
minute. I've found that if I ever try and speak to anybody in Ukraine from a position of not all Russians are complicit in what's happening and they're also losing their family members and people are dying, I've personally found very little sympathy for that. There is, as also backed up by what Antonina told me, what she's found of her research, but I've definitely seen it. It's just very pure hatred. And often if there's a bombing, I'll get messages from my contacts in Ukraine and they'll just be like, how can these people be human? Like, how can you, like this thing in Kyiv last Wednesday, how can you bomb a playground and kill children in the middle of the day? These people are not human anymore. There is like a huge concern that, yes, this is storing up huge aggression and retaliation one day in the future. And even if there is a ceasefire and even if bombs stop falling, there will always be fear. And it might sound strange. I was I've lived in England almost my whole life, but I'm half Polish. I have Polish relatives, and I have always felt the shadow of Russia, if I can put it like that, just because it's there the whole time. This undertone, this undercurrent of what happened in the Second World War. And this is just brought everything back again. Like, there's no trust, there's no sympathy. That's what I've personally seen. Maybe you'll find other examples, but that's my experience.
Thank you, Gabriella. And Yumna, you wanted to come in as well.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I believe now that the major dilemma of what we're going through in the world now is or storms from the double standards that we live within. Now, I can't cherish humanity and choose a group of people to cherish their humanity over another, or call them human over the other. I can't say that I believe that every single child should be safe. Oh, but except for this group, because of the race, nationality, color, religion, whatsoever. And that's why, like Martin just mentioned, when I was reporting on the October 7th, I was reporting about, of course, as a journalist, I'm not there to give my opinion, but I was reporting exactly what had happened in the Israeli towns by the Palestinian fighters, what had happened by the people who went in, how the Israeli families were subjected to that terror, to that frightenness, to whatever had happened to them. Everything that had happened, I was stating facts and evidence, okay? But I can't not say that, oh, I don't feel sorry for these civilians, Israeli civilians and families on the other side for what happened to them. Then here, this is where double standards come. And at the same time, there's no comparison of what's happening in Gaza to the Palestinian children and families compared to what happened in Israel. You can't, after killing 1,139 people in Israel, kill over 60,000 and still say, oh, there is a balance. This is just not, it's just, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't happen like that. I can't even believe that people would even think about it, that you can't watch, I'm sorry, but you can't watch Israeli families and residents and civilians, okay, tearing up humanitarian aid that is entering to starving children in Gaza, tearing it up and destroying it and banning it from entering, to leave those children on the other side of the border to die for no reason. What are they being punished for? This is the main idea. Israel is collectively punishing an entire population, and they're paying the heaviest price for crimes they have never committed, and they had no hand, no finger in. And I can't say that both cases are in any way compared to each other. But at the same time, I can't not have sympathy for both sides, but each on their amount of suffering.
Okay, thank you, Yumna. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Were there any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious, I think, Rafael, the role of footage and film and imagery and social media on this thing of traumas not stopping. So even, you know, when Yumna's talking about how affected her family is, however, I think you said 2 years since you evacuated, or in that time period since you evacuated, and yet you can just relive it every single second through your phone. And that being also this mass scale of catastrophic mental health impact. I'm curious if your work is also covering the impact of film and footage.
Not directly, no, but I think this connects a little bit to the previous question as well, and it's also almost like the like the byproducts of a very ongoing traumatic situation going on. Over time, it brings toxicity all around at the end of the day. So, you know, it's very difficult to connect in empathy with the other side when there's you know, when in the context of trauma and distress, every human's position would be to center themselves on the survival, right? And inevitably leads to a situation of dehumanizing the other. Eventually it becomes intergenerational, and at the end of the day, it's all bad news. So in the context, this is happening in terms of the social media. My exposure to this with children is not so much with my work in the West Bank or with MAP. It's actually in my NHS work, which is located in East London, and we actually, for a variety of reasons of the demographics there, we tend to see lots of young persons who are quite interested in the conflict and often quite politically engaged. With that comes a lot of over focus, and I would say extreme, you know, unhealthy focus on footage, on video. On the one hand, I mean, the conversations about the role of media violence in mental health are, you know, are really long-standing. And there's always a difference of opinion. In this situation in particular, I strongly believe it kind of lends itself to vicarious trauma and to basically lots of young persons becoming overly anxious and distressed by the images that they're seeing. I think it's a wider society problem. As I said at the beginning of this answer, it has to do a lot with just the extreme violence that we are just all bearing witness to. And, you know, that is the reality. And the other one is this really recent and fast development of how media is just accessible to all of us. And in many ways, me and my colleagues, we see all the impacts of that on anxiety, depression, isolation on a daily basis. But knowing what would be the public health implications of this moving forward is very hard to state, but I imagine we're probably looking at something quite dire, you know. And to answer your question.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for attending. And let's just give a round of applause to our wonderful speakers and to you now. So, yeah, thank you so much for attending, and thank you also to the Frontline Club who have hosted us today, and they, like Index, also do brilliant work supporting independent journalism. If you're interested in supporting Frontline, you can speak to any of the staff here, and if you're interested in supporting Index on censorship, please do come and speak to me. We're a non-profit and we do rely on donations, so sorry to give you the hard sell, but we do have a QR code at the back. If you'd like to donate today, you can just do that on your smartphone. But in the meantime, if you'd like to stick around, you can head downstairs for a drink at the bar now as well, and the speakers will be here for a little bit as well if you want to grab them for any more questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All I just wanted to do.
Yes.